Hello and welcome back, goats, to the BigBluePurple channel, and to the final part of my normal mode trial ranking so far, until Endwalker is complete of course. Today we will be taking a look at the Shadowbringers trials. Again, this will specifically be taking a look at the normal mode trials and not the extremes, because I have not done any of the extremes for this expansion yet. If you happen to stumble upon this video and haven't seen my previous trial rankings yet, they're up on my channel if you're interested in what I think of the other expansion's normal trials. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into this ranking. Coming in at the bottom spot of my list for the Shadowbringers trial ranking, we have the Ruby Weapon. Now, despite the Ruby Weapon having one of the coolest designs out of any of the bosses in this game, the fight itself is pretty forgettable and underwhelming, I would say. While this fight may be at the bottom of the list, it is nowhere near as bad of a fight as the lowest points in Stormblood and Heavenswood. This is no Bismarck or Rathalos. This fight is a solid trial and it's well made. It's just that every other Shadowbringers trial is more memorable than this by a long shot in my opinion. Also, remember how I said I thought the design was cool? Well, halfway through the fight when you take down his first health bar, they say fuck that and just turn him into Nail from the Coil raids. This is definitely cool the first time you see it, but to be honest with you, I think I'd prefer this fight if it was just the Ruby Weapon and nothing else. Mechanically speaking, I don't really have much to say about this fight either. There's this one part where you hide behind a boulder and that's kinda cool, I guess. But generally this fight is just really forgettable and I don't care for it that much. But I also don't hate this fight or get mad when I see it in my trial reload. It's just a pretty easy and quick fight. For this to be the lowest quality trial in the expansion though, says a lot about the quality of the trials to come. Also, the music for the weapon trials absolutely bangs, but that applies to every weapon trial, so I'm not really going to give Ruby any points for that. Overall, this is like the epitome of a B tier normal trial if I was putting this on a tier list. Coming in at number 6 on the ranking, we have Titania. I actually like this trial a lot considering what it is. I'm not a huge fan of the design or the music of this fight, yet at the same time I think it's incredibly memorable and mechanically very interesting for a normal mode fight. For the very first trial in Shadowbringers, they weren't afraid to up the difficulty for this expansion, knowing that players have been playing this game for years now. There's some actual tighter dodges in this normal trial, and the ads phase requires some knowledge to clear it properly. And that's one thing I have to massively credit this trial for, is making an ads phase I actually find interesting. There are so many ads phases in this game that I think are just filler and a complete waste of the player's time. I like this ad phase, and I think it's well designed, and I think that's a rare thing in this game if I'm being completely honest. There's also a specific order you need to kill the ads in, but unlike the old King Mugomog trial, I don't find this annoying at all, and it's pretty intuitive. You just have to remember to kill them in a counterclockwise rotation every time. There's also actual mechanics that go out during this ad phase, so it's not just a filler phase where you need to wail on some enemies to progress the fight. There's actually stuff going on here that you need to pay attention to. This sounds like a simple concept that should be executed on in every ads phase in normal trials, but unfortunately that's not the case, and a lot of ads phases, specifically in normal mode trials, are very boring and uninteresting. I also enjoy the setting and scenery of this trial compared to other ones. I feel like it's just really memorable. This fight also gives Duty Finder a ton of trouble in my experience, so that can be either very entertaining or very soul-crushing depending on the mood you're in that day. It's also pretty hard for me to come up with anything negative to say about this trial despite it being in the 6th spot. I guess my major complaint, and really only complaint, would be the lack of a huge cinematic moment that the other trials nail so well in this expansion. Kicking off the top 5 of this list, we have FFXIV, or the Innocence trial. My one and only major complaint with this fight is that the first phase is essentially entirely filler, but I guess you could argue that it's necessary filler for the transition in the fight to be so impactful. And this is honestly one of the most memorable transitions in the entire game. Who could have expected when they started Shadowbringers that FFXIV would just become hot mid-fight? It's absolutely hilarious. And going into the second phase, or the actual boss fight of this trial, it's a really, really good boss. It's the epitome of a trial that has no like knowledge check mechanics, but more so just a bunch of dodgeable AoEs that you need to react to quickly. Whereas a lot of normal trials in this game tend to experiment with new ideas and mechanics, FFXIV does a very good job at just honing in on what they know works and making it feel really fun and satisfying to play. There's nothing really groundbreaking mechanically here, but it's just really damn fun. The music for this trial is also absolutely fantastic and one of my favorite OSTs in the entire game. Shadowbringers in general, it just has such an amazing soundtrack overall. This trial does an absolutely amazing job at subverting the player's expectations after building up FFXIV throughout all of Shadowbringers for him to turn into a completely different type of trial than we all would have expected. An insanely memorable cinematic combined with a very solid and fun fight makes one of the better trials in this entire game, I would say. This is totally one of those fights I'd be interested in seeing on Extreme to see how they evolve these kind of simple mechanics and make them more interesting. I'm sure a lot of people would rank FFXIV even higher than this for how impactful of a moment this was in the story, but to me personally, the other trials I have above it are a little bit better in my opinion. Next up on my list, coming in at the number 4 spot, we have the Emerald Weapon. This was one of the hardest trials for me to place on this list because I feel like it could have even been number 2 on this list depending on how I'm feeling. I really, really love the Emerald Weapon trial. I think the greatest advantage that this trial has is that both phases are very distinct and have their own unique mechanics that make them worth playing. The first phase doesn't just feel like a filler phase before you get to the real fight. I feel like this fight does a fantastic job of using both experimental unique mechanics as well as reactable dodgy mechanics that we see in every kind of fight. If you just look at the simple Mario Kart laser mechanic in this fight, they throw in an extra layer of dodges with expanding donut AoEs, so you actually have more than one thing to think about. And I appreciate this as a player who's gotten to Shadowbringers because you're better at the game at this point and then you need the mechanics to be a little bit more demanding to keep you engaged. And I've alluded to mention this so far, but I think the Shadowbringers trials do a much better job than any other expansion with ramping up the difficulty to meet players' skill. Obviously, these are still normal trials and they're meant to be cleared by anyone, but at the same time, they're more mechanically demanding than the previous expansions, and I can really appreciate that as a player. The first phase of this fight is one thing, but goddamn man, the second phase of this fight, with Gaius's combat data coming into play, that shit is crazy. I absolutely love the way the arena changes in this fight, because it gives the fight so much more identity than just being in your average Garlean Castrum. I love the storyline for these weapon trials as well, and I think Emerald Weapon in specific has the most cinematic and memorable kind of story experience out of all of the weapons. Also, the music is just an absolute banger and definitely my favorite of the weapon themes. And I mean, come on, the golden version of the Emerald Weapon looks cool as shit. I also like that instead of your traditional ad phase, this fight kind of has like a intermission boss with the Phantom of Gaius you have to fight. Overall, this fight just checks every box for me in terms of what I like in a trial, and I absolutely love it. And it's crazy for me to be able to say that this is number 4 on the list, because it goes to show just how much I love these next 3 trials. Despite how much I actually love the Emerald Weapon, the Diamond Weapon, after a couple of replays for the sake of this video, has become my favorite weapon trial in the game. For reference, before making this video, the Shadowbringers trials were without a doubt my least played trials in the game. They never really show up in roulette because they're level 80, and I didn't really go out of my way to run any of these more than once because there's no reason to. This meant a lot of the trials felt fresh and interesting when I got to try them again, and the Diamond Weapon in specific stood out to me so much that I ended up replaying it multiple times. I absolutely love the gimmick in this fight of jumping between the 2 platforms because I think it's used so tastefully. The fight isn't like a constant spam of having to go back and forth, it's very specific on when you need to move and why you need to move, and it makes perfect sense. This fight has plenty of mechanics sprinkled in that aren't related to jumping between sides of the platform, so it doesn't feel like you're just in this perpetual loop of having to move around and it gets tedious. There's also this super cool intermission phase where the diamond weapon transforms into Ifrit or some shit, and you have to fight him in that form without jumping between the two platforms. I much prefer the boss having a cool and interesting middle phase like this than just spawning like 10 ads and you need to kill them within 45 minutes or it'll wipe the team. Like, this is far more interesting and fun to play as a player. I also give this extra points for basically making its cinematic moment the playable experience. You don't just watch the diamond weapon transform into Ifrit, do this big AoE, and then turn back into the diamond weapon. Like, you actually get to fight him during this transformation before he switches back. A good gimmick combined with an interesting boss arena and well thought out mechanics makes for one of the most interesting and well paced trials in the entire game in my opinion. I am so glad that I went and replayed these trials for the sake of this video because I was sleeping on the diamond weapon. I hardly remembered it from the first time I did it, and this trial is so fantastic. It's honestly great. I'm super interested in trying this fight on Extreme at some point because I'd love to see how they incorporate this gimmick with more difficult and demanding mechanics. Diamond Weapon has recently become one of my favorite trials in this whole goddamn game, and I think giving him the number 3 spot makes the most sense. Coming in at number 2 on my list is none other than Hades himself. I debated putting this trial lower than the diamond weapon and even the emerald weapon, but I eventually decided that the story moment from this fight was so goddamn impactful that it carries this trial to the number 2 spot. If somebody asked me what the most memorable and iconic trial in this game was to me, I would probably say Hades. After I beat this trial for the first time, I literally went back and played it like 3 more times because I could not get over how hype that story moment was. Shadowbringers was the most invested I had been in a video game story in a very long time when I was playing it, and this fight was such an amazing payoff as a trial. And just because I don't think it's as mechanically interesting as the diamond weapon, doesn't mean I don't think it's mechanically interesting at all. I think there are some pretty cool ideas here, and they're executed really well. The fight also does a good job at having 2 distinct phases similar to the emerald weapon. Both phases are important to the fight, and one doesn't just feel like filler. The ads phase is probably the least interesting part of the fight, but I still think it's a better ads phase than a lot of the other trials in this game. Also, Hades impaling himself with his own staff for his transformation is raw as fuck. In both phases of the fight, he also just looks cool as shit, and I think that's really important in a trial boss. If they look cool, they're more interesting to fight. I think the visuals in this fight are also executed really well. They're very memorable without being too flashy or overwhelming to the player. I also think the active time event used in this fight is completely fine here because it is the conclusion of Shadowbringers, and having a big moment where you get to break free with your light is important to a conclusion like this. Hades is an extremely cinematic conclusion to Shadowbringers, and I don't think he's quite as good as Shinryu in terms of mechanics, but I do think he is the more memorable fight of the 2 overall. Despite my love for Hades as the conclusion to Shadowbringers, there is one boss who you've probably figured out by now is my absolute favorite in all of Shadowbringers, and potentially my favorite in the entire game. So let's get to number 1. If you hadn't guessed it from the start, the Warrior of Light, or Elidibus, is my favorite trial in Shadowbringers, and I'm sure it is many people's favorite trial in Shadowbringers, if not many people's favorite trial in the entire game. First of all, the fight takes place in the final room from the Circus Tower raid, which is cool as shit. Secondly, Elidibus as the Warrior of Light is one of my favorite boss designs in the entire game. And thirdly, this is one of the biggest story moments in the entire game that is told through a trial. This is probably the best instance of trial storytelling we've ever seen, all topped off by some super interesting and well-designed mechanics. This normal trial literally gets every single thing right in my opinion, and has pretty much no flaws at all. I'm not sure how the extreme version of this fight works, but I imagine if you have to watch that cutscene every time on extreme while you're farming the mount, that could be pretty frustrating. But again, this is a normal trial ranking, so I'm not really considering those things at all. This intermission cutscene where Elidibus thinks he's won and Emmett Selk shows up to save your ass is such an insane story moment told through the trial. No other trial in this entire game got me as hyped up as this singular moment. Even the Endwalker trials, which have been absolutely fantastic so far, have not gotten me as excited as this single moment did. There's also a really sick tank LB moment in this fight, and I think we just need more tank LB moments like this in general because goddamn, only the melees ever get to LB, and I think it's really cool when the tanks actually have to use it for once. I'm not a tank man, but I imagine it feels really damn good to press that button. There's also such a huge variety of different mechanics in this fight, and reusing mechanics that are taught to you in the first phase in more complicated ways in the second phase. It feels like every time I go into this fight, I notice or learn something that I had missed on the previous run. Out of all these Shadowbringers trials in the game, this is definitely the one I want to try on Extreme the most, which, makes sense given that it's my number one. I absolutely love the Warrior of Light trial, and I think everybody who plays this game and has made it this far absolutely loves the Warrior of Light trial because it's just so damn good, and I think it's the best trial in the game. Also, the song that plays during this trial is just so fucking good, and it adds so much to the experience. It's crazy how much music adds to these normal trials, man. But all in all, this is how I would currently rank the Shadowbringers trials and how I feel about them. To be fair, these are definitely my least played normal trials in the entire game. I've probably even played the Endwalker ones more than this because I've somehow seen them in roulette more. Overall, it was an absolute treat replaying these trials for the sake of this video because I just had so little experience with them and they all felt fresh and new. Having ranked all of the Shadowbringers trials now though, this will conclude my trial ranking series until we get the rest of the Endwalker trials so I can make a full video talking about that. Going forward, in terms of rankings, I think it might be fun to do an Alliance raid ranking, or a normal raid ranking, or maybe even a dungeon ranking if people wanted to see that. So let me know in the comments below if you want to see any of those things. I'll also put up a poll on my channel as to what you guys might want to see next in terms of ranking videos, because I want to kind of keep a running series in the background of my channel, just kind of ranking the different content in 14. I think it's fun to make, and I think it could be interesting to listen to for some people. Otherwise, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these trials in the comments below. What's your favorite trial in Shadowbringers? What do you agree with about my list? What do you disagree with? Leave a like on the video, but only if you did, and subscribe to the BigBluePurple channel if you're not already. Go run some normal trials, and I'll catch you in the next one.